How the people are doing? So, it is finally time for us to dive deep into the X30 Ultra's cameras, and well, it is going up against what I would consider to be one of the, if not probably the best photography camera on the market right now, the X80 Pro. And well, let's see how it performs, because there are a lot of things that the X30 Ultra has to live up to, and let's just say the X80 is no slouch, now is it? So jumping right in, we are starting off with a very close-up subject right here. But yeah, one thing that I do notice is that the X30 did not focus on the flower, it focused on the stem just behind it. But yeah, anyways, I do think that the colors are very close. The X80, obviously, we are using Zeiss's natural colors, and it's extremely natural, needless to say. The X30 does look a little bit more vibrant, and maybe some people do prefer that. Now here's an ultra-wide shot, and well, it wasn't intense backlight, but there was definitely a little bit of backlight situation going on right here. And I do think that the X30 is kind of blowing things out, especially with the sky, while the X80 is doing a sort of a good job in maintaining the colors in there. And also, speaking of colors, I mean, look at the difference in vibrance. That's definitely something to keep in mind. You don't really have a natural option on the X30, so this is exactly what you're going to get. Now, if you wanted a real backlit situation, this is a real backlit situation with the main cameras. And you know, even though yes, the angle isn't perfect, well, in my defense, the sun was right up in my eyes right there. So anyways, I do think both are doing a really good job here. There's really nothing to complain about. Both do look really nice, and I actually really like the X30's extra bit of contrast. It does make things look more punchy compared to the X80, which goes for a more flatter look. Now, similar situation, you know, really backlit with the sun in the background with the ultra-wide cameras, and I mean, the differences are also exactly the same. The H30 is giving us more vibrance, more contrast, which I do like, just the contrast, not the vibrance, but well, the X80 is the one with the natural colors, as you'd expect. The dynamic range in question here, it's basically the same across the board, and it's really good on both, as you'd expect. Now then, let's just say you don't like the X80's natural look that we've been going for this entire time. You can turn off Zeiss's natural colors and you can use the AI mode, and that will give you a lot of vibrance and really punchy images in general. It's actually looking better with the higher contrast on the X80 compared to the H30, which looks a little overexposed. Even though up until now, the H30 was doing a really good job with contrast, so I guess it kind of screwed this one up. Now moving on, there is a very interesting feature on the H30. It's called Auto High Resolution. You can turn it on in the settings, and basically what it does is that if your lighting is good enough and you know it's not a super backlit image or anything like that, then you can get 50 megapixel images right out the gate. And that's exactly what we got here. You can see the image looks really nice, but then if you zoom in, the detail levels are way higher. Obviously, it's got 50 megapixels on the H30, so of course it has way higher details, way less over sharpening going on compared to the X80. I think it's a very interesting and a very clever feature, and it's something that basically every phone should be capable of, but we don't really see the implementation, at least not yet. Now here's another main camera shot, and I mean the overcast situations are pretty crazy, as you can see. This was at around 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and we don't even see the sun. it's that crazy. But anyways, what I do really like in this case is very simply the high contrast on the H30. It is more vibrant compared to what was realistic, but the higher contrast on the H30, it's definitely pulling my attention, and I do like it compared to the X80 in this case. You know, as nice as Zeiss's natural colors are, it does screw up sometimes. Now moving on to 2x zoom. Now the H30 does have a 2x optical zoom, and I do think that the high contrast is helping it out a lot over here, because the X80 looks very flat, way too flat in my opinion, because in this case, I mean, you're almost losing out some details in the clouds because of just how low contrast the shot is. But then of course, at 5x, the X80 will take the lead. It doesn't have a very high quality 5x as such, but compared to not having any 5x zoom whatsoever, the Moto Edge 30 obviously falls behind. Now this shot is very interesting because on one hand, yeah, no pun intended, you can see that the H30 is giving us really high contrast, and in a way it looks quite nice, but because of the way the lighting was, I like how the X80 looks here. It looks a little bit more even, a little bit more how it naturally looked when I took the shot. And secondly, because I'm holding this extra large cup of coffee. I mean, it's a definition of extra large right there. Now then, 200 megapixels. Yeah, that's how many megapixels you can get on the H30 Ultra. Impressive as a number, yes, but does it really work? Well, I guess the answer is twofold, because in a case like this, when the lighting isn't perfect, it won't work out. You can see we're zooming into 6 times, and I tend to zoom into just 5 times, but I zoomed into 6 times just to make a point here. The H30 is not doing a particularly better job compared to the 48 megapixels on the X80. And the X80 in general, it just doesn't do a very good job with detail preservation, even with high resolution. So in a case like this, the 200 megapixels is not doing anything at all. Now in this case, this was basically the maximum amount of light I could have gotten. It was still overcast, so I couldn't really do anything about getting proper daylight, but it did show up some difference. The texture on the road, some of the texture in the trees is better compared to the X80. But you want to know how much I had to zoom in just to get a legitimate amount of difference like this? I think this was a 9 times zoom, 900% crop, just to see the difference between 48 and 200 megapixels. I think the 200 megapixels is going to be more of a gimmick. Yeah, technically it does give you more detail, but it's just going to end up being a feature that you have in your phone and you just almost never end up using it. But then we also get 50 megapixels on the ultra-wide cameras. I do want to point out that the X80 Pro has way more accurate white balance compared to the H30, but if we crop in this time to just 500%, yeah, you can see that the X80, it does go for a slightly more sharpened approach compared to the H30 that just doesn't do any sharpening whatsoever. And I do like the X80 in this case. I mean, it is giving us a fair bit more detail compared to the H30 here. Now this right here is an indoor lighting situation, and it does give us a very good idea that the Vivo X80 Pro has definitively better white balance compared to the H30. I mean, it's a small difference, but the way the Vivo is handling the warmth, it's definitely much more accurate. And well, in cases like these, I just cannot help but praise Vivo for the Zeiss natural colors. It just works out so extremely well in a situation like this. I mean, you can see the oversaturation happening on the H30 Ultra. To my eyes, that just does not look very nice. Up next for macro, the H30 Ultra can get closer compared to the X80 Pro, and it does give you slightly more detail compared to the X80 as well. That's surprising because both are using the ultra-wide cameras, and well, the ultra-wide detail preservation was better on the X80, but in macro it's better on the H30. So that's definitely interesting. Then moving on to selfies, and yes indeed, I am holding on to the Pixel 7 Pro. It's finally here. It's here on time. That's a big deal, and well, the camera comparisons are gonna be juicy as hell, so definitely stay tuned for those. And the selfie itself, I would say neither are doing a particularly good job, even though there was a fair amount of daylight coming in, and both are giving sort of noisy results. I'm not really sure why, but yeah, that's just how it is. Now in a harsh backlit condition, the X80 does pull ahead, but the general quality of selfies on the X80 is just not that good, especially because the rear cameras are so impressive that the selfies are just, they're not really going to impress people all that much. But portrait selfies, both are doing a really good job in this case. Surprisingly, the normal selfies are not that good, but the portrait selfies do work out really well on both. Now the H30 Ultra does have a little bit more red in my skin tones than I would personally like, but yeah, for the most part, I do think both are looking quite nice here, given the backlit situation as well. Now, in warm light, I do think that the X80 is more natural, while the H30 gives us maybe a little bit more of a pleasing look. You get more saturation in the skin tones, and the warmth is sort of becoming an orange, and I guess, in a way it does make things look pleasing. A night mode selfie, this is something the X80 is taking a win at. I don't even have to tell you that because it's plenty obvious in this case. Alright, now what about rear camera portraits? And yes, the Vivo X80 Pro is probably one of the best for portraits. It has a lot of customizable options. In this case, we are using planar portraits. I think is the best for normal portraits like these. It just gives you this heightened contrast, and it just looks really nice on the X80. The H30 is not bad. I mean, it does have a fair amount of saturation, and the contrast is really good in this case as well. But when in a backlit situation, the X80 does pull ahead. just by a little bit, because the X30 is doing a fairly good job with me as a subject. I mean, it does have fine contrast, but it is blowing out the background more than the X80, so that's the reason why I think the X80 is doing a slightly better job here. Now moving on to 2x, this is a regular lighting shot, and you can see both are doing a really good job here. Now the skin tones, I kinda like the slightly less brightened look on the X30 here compared to the X80, which is brightening things a bit too much in my opinion. I think the exposure could have been handled a little bit better maybe. But yeah, the X30 Ultra is definitely taking a slight lead here. But then for this shot, backlit, and that's also me sipping that extra lush cup of coffee, and as you can see, the X80 is definitively doing a much better job compared to the X30 here. Quite simply, it just handles the highlights better, and the skin tones, the contrast, it's being handled surprisingly well. Now here's another zoomed in shot on both phones, and as you can see, the X80 is just doing a better job at balancing things out properly. The X30 is blowing some highlights, and the white balance isn't quite right compared to the X80 at least. So yeah, I think the X80 is definitely doing a much better job with portraits. And also because the Vivo gives us proper night mode portraits, which work out really well on the X80 over here compared to just no real option on the S30 Ultra. Now then, moving on to night mode. Now this is where things might turn around a little. It will depend on personal preference, but as you can see in this case, the Moto S30 Ultra is giving us higher contrast and higher vibrance. Now the higher contrast part is what really draws my attention, and I really like the look here. The X80 has a severe tendency of making the night mode shots look really flat. Now you may like that, you may think that it's a very safe approach, and I guess it kind of makes sense, but personally I like a little bit more contrast in my shots. Similar story here. I mean, you can see just how much brighter the X80 is. While the H30 is giving us the good contrast, it's maintaining the exposure quite well here. It looks very accurate in a manner of speaking. And this shot right here, this is my favorite because the H30 does so damn well. I mean, look at the noise reduction in the sky. It is perfect. There's like barely even a grain of noise on the H30 Ultra. The colors are really good. The contrast is worthy of a chef's kiss, and I mean, it's a perfect shot on the H30 in this case. Well, not so much on the X80 Pro. But then, you know, high contrast, it doesn't always work out. In a case like this, the H30 is definitely crushing shadows a bit too much. The X80 still looks flat, you know, it's not exactly looking perfect, but it does give you a lot of shadow detail. And that just means that if you wanted, you could pump up the contrast a little bit more, but you cannot get back shadow detail from the X30 Ultra's image. But then as soon as, you know, we make the situations worse, you know, the backlit conditions, light gets less, the X80 starts to pull ahead. You can see right here, the X80 is doing a far better job. The white balance, shadow detail, both are being handled so much better compared to the H30 Ultra. And in this case, we're using the ultra wide camera. X80 Pro is giving us far more detail. The color of the table is very accurate compared to this weird magenta that's happening on the H30 Ultra. So yeah, for the most part, it looks really good on the X80 here. And as I said, the lower the light gets, the better the X80 Pro gets, because as you can see, in ultra low light situations like these, the X80, it really is unparalleled. There, at least thus far, I haven't seen a single smartphone that can really rival the X80's brightening powers in ultra low light scenes. I mean, look at how perfectly maintained every element of the image is. This is, I mean, I've seen these images more than enough times, but it still manages to impress me. The X80 is really that good. For the ultra wide camera, similar story. I mean, this is an ultra wide shot on both phones, and you can see that one of them looks like we didn't even use a night mode, even though both took, I think, similar 4-second exposures. I'm not entirely certain on that, but yeah, it was close. And well, the X80's processing, it just takes it to another level entirely. So that brings us to the end of this camera comparison, and well, I think the H30 Ultra performed fairly well, but it does have its drawbacks, and you know, all of that would be fine had it had that amazing 200 megapixel level of detail that anyone in their right mind would have expected it to have. And yes, the auto high-res feature, amazing on the H30 Ultra. It's almost a genius feature that works out really well in most situations. You know, most daylight shots that do not have terrible lighting, you're gonna get a 50 megapixel shot, and you're gonna get terrific amounts of detail with that. But the 200 megapixel mode itself is just not good enough. if we were to disregard that for a second, the X30 Ultra really performed quite well. Being entirely honest here, it stacked up against the X80 in a lot of situations. Night mode, I actually preferred it. In regular, normal low light conditions, it did a really good job compared to the X80. In ultra low light, nothing really stacks up against the X80, so well, that point is kind of moot. But yeah, I do hope you guys enjoyed this comparison. Well, I sure as hell did. It was quite enlightening, and it also goes to show that numbers literally don't mean anything in a lot of cases. And well, of course, subscribe if you haven't already, because there are a lot more camera comparisons to come, especially with the Pixel 7 Pro. I'll be seeing you guys soon enough. Cheers.